History often teaches us that wars begin with ambition, with hatred, with carefully planned evil. But sometimes, war begins with something far quieter. A sentence, a poorly worded message, a moment where meaning slipped and pride took over. Tonight, we begin the story of a war that reshaped Europe, not because leaders wanted it, but because someone misunderstood what was said. This is the story of the Franco-Prussian War, and it began with bad communication. In the summer of 1870, Europe was tense, but not yet burning. France was powerful, proud, and deeply protective of its status. Prussia, rising quietly under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck, was reshaping the German states through diplomacy and calculated pressure. What's important to understand is this: neither side was actively planning a full-scale war at that moment. There were rivalries, yes, suspicion, certainly, but also restraint. Until one message broke that balance. The issue began far away from battlefields, in Spain. Spain's throne was empty, and the country searched for a new king. They considered a German prince, Leopold of Hohenzollern, a distant relative of the Prussian king. To Prussia, this was a minor diplomatic detail. To France, it felt like encirclement. France feared being surrounded by Prussian influence, east and south. So, France demanded reassurance. They wanted Prussia to promise, formally, that Leopold would never take the Spanish throne. And initially, Prussia agreed to step back. Crisis avoided. At least, it seemed so. On July 13, 1870, France's ambassador met Prussia's king Wilhelm I in a small spa town called Ems. The meeting was polite, calm, respectful. The king refused to give permanent guarantees, but he did so gently. After the meeting, King Wilhelm sent a telegram to his chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, summarizing what had happened. It was meant to be informational, routine, unremarkable. This message would later be called the Ems Dispatch, and this is where everything changed. The edit that lit the fire, controversial turn. Bismarck received the message, and he made a choice. He shortened it, edited it, removed polite language, not by adding lies, but by removing softness. The edited version made it sound as though the French ambassador had been dismissed abruptly. The Prussian king had insulted France. Diplomacy had broken down publicly. When newspapers printed the edited dispatch, the tone felt sharp, cold, humiliating. To the French public, it read like an insult. To the Prussian public, it read like strength. No one questioned the wording. Few checked the original. Pride filled the silence where clarity should have been. Here is the uncomfortable truth. The war did not begin because of an invasion. It did not begin because of a secret attack. It did not begin because diplomacy failed. It began because tone was misread and language was weaponized. Within days, France declared war on Prussia. Millions would suffer. Not because leaders misunderstood intent, but because they misunderstood words. France had declared war on Prussia. Crowds cheered. Newspapers spoke of honor restored. Most people believed this war would be short. They were wrong. In 1870, France felt invincible. It had a proud military tradition, veterans of earlier wars, a reputation as Europe's dominant power. Politicians promised a quick victory. Generals assured the public that France would strike fast and decisively. There was confidence, but little preparation. Behind the scenes, France's army was disorganized. Supply lines were unclear. Command structures were confused. But none of this reached the public. What people heard was simple: we are strong, we will win. Prussia did not celebrate loudly. Instead, it mobilized. Railway timetables, prepared years in advance, were activated. troops moved with precision. Communication between units was efficient and centralized. Unlike France, Prussia had spent years preparing for a war it claimed not to want. This contrast would soon matter. Very much. Within weeks, the illusion shattered. French forces crossed into German territory, but were met with resistance far stronger than expected. Battles followed quickly. Confusion spread. Orders arrived late. Units moved without coordination. Supplies failed to reach the front. Meanwhile, Prussian forces advanced methodically, not rushing, not panicking, just moving forward. Each encounter drained French morale. Each report contradicted the optimistic headlines back home. Then came the Battle of Sedan. It was meant to be a turning point for France. Instead, it became a symbol of collapse. Surrounded by Prussian forces, the French army found itself trapped. Shells rained down, communication broke, escape routes vanished. And then something unimaginable happened. France's emperor, Napoleon III, surrendered. Not negotiated, not delayed, surrendered. An emperor captured on the battlefield. When the news reached Paris, disbelief turned into panic. The war was no longer distant, it was personal. What followed was chaos. The French government collapsed. Paris prepared for siege. Civilians suffered shortages and fear. And all of this traced back not to a master plan, but to escalation born from pride and miscommunication. It is tempting to say this war was inevitable, but historians still debate that. Some argue that without the edited dispatch, France may not have declared war at all. Others believe the conflict would have come eventually, but not then, and not like this. That uncertainty is what makes this story unsettling. Here is the controversy history rarely sits with. If words had been softer, if tone had been preserved, if pride had paused for clarification, would millions still have suffered? We often imagine history shaped by grand villains, but here the damage came from something smaller: an edit, a headline, a refusal to slow down and ask what was really meant. In January of 1871, while Paris was still starving under siege, something remarkable and deeply symbolic took place. Inside the Palace of Versailles, the very heart of French royal pride, Prussia made an announcement. The German states were unified. A new nation was born: Germany. Not in Berlin, not in Frankfurt, but in France's most sacred palace. This was not accidental. It was a message. Otto von Bismarck understood something many leaders did not. Wars do not end when treaties are signed. They end when memory is shaped. By declaring the German Empire inside Versailles, Bismarck ensured that France would never forget its defeat. France was forced to watch as its enemies celebrated on its own soil, inside its own symbol of power. The humiliation cut deeper than any battlefield loss, and humiliation lingers. The Treaty of Frankfurt followed soon after. France lost territory, Alsace and Lorraine. It paid enormous reparations. Its army was limited. But more damaging than land or money was the psychological wound. A nation that had once dominated Europe was now reminded, publicly, of its vulnerability. In cafes and homes across France, a quiet resentment began to grow. Not loud, not violent, but patient. Meanwhile, Germany rose quickly. Unified under Prussian leadership, it became industrial, efficient, and powerful. Railroads expanded, factories multiplied, science and military organization advanced rapidly. To many, Germany appeared unstoppable. But power, when gained suddenly, often brings fear, both in others and within itself. The balance of Europe had shifted, and Europe noticed. Here is the part history often rushes past. France did not forget. Children were taught about lost provinces. Maps marked territories taken. Stories of humiliation were quietly passed down. No revenge was declared, no immediate action taken, but memory was preserved. And memory, when shared across generations, becomes dangerous. Some historians argue that without the Franco-Prussian War, there might never have been a World War I. This claim is debated, but it cannot be dismissed, because this war planted three powerful seeds: a unified Germany, confident and dominant, a humiliated France, patient and resentful, and a Europe suddenly aware that diplomacy could collapse overnight, all from a message that should have been harmless. What this war reveals is something unsettling. Peace is not maintained by strength alone. It is maintained by clarity, by restraint, by leaders willing to pause instead of provoke. The Franco-Prussian War reminds us that history can turn not on grand evil, but on small, careless decisions: an edit, a tone, a refusal to explain.
Where you can direct a voice, create realistic dialogue, and so much more. Edit these placeholders to get started.
Germany, newly unified, stood taller than ever before. But unity brought anxiety. For the first time, Germany was surrounded by potential enemies, nations unsettled by its sudden power. Leaders in Berlin believed peace could only be maintained through strength. So strength became policy. Armies expanded, conscription became routine, military planning seeped into everyday life. Germany did not believe war was coming immediately, but it believed it was inevitable. Otto von Bismarck understood the danger. He knew Germany's power frightened Europe. He knew alliances could form against it. So he worked tirelessly to prevent war. Treaties, agreements, delicate diplomacy. Bismarck did not seek glory, he sought stability. But stability built on fear is fragile. Across the continent, other powers watched closely. Britain remained cautious, guarding its empire. Austria-Hungary felt pressure from nationalism within its borders. Russia watched Germany's rise with suspicion. The lesson learned from the Franco-Prussian War was simple and dangerous. Wars could begin suddenly, not after years of warning, not after long mobilization, but from pride, pressure, and misunderstanding. So everyone began preparing. Here lies the quiet controversy. Before 1870, war was seen as avoidable through diplomacy. After 1870, war became something to prepare for constantly. Military plans grew rigid. Mobilization schedules became irreversible. Once started, they could not be stopped. Peace became something temporary, a pause. France remembered humiliation. Germany remembered triumph. Both memories shaped behavior. Each military exercise, each alliance, each political speech. History was no longer behind them, it was watching. To prevent isolation, nations formed alliances. But alliances create obligations. One conflict could pull many into war. A localized problem could spread across borders, just as a single message once did. Consider this. The Franco-Prussian War began with miscommunication. The world learned to respond by preparing for the worst. But preparation can create the very outcome it fears. Arms races breed suspicion. Suspicion breeds rigidity. Rigidity removes choice. By the early 20th century, Europe was armed, aligned, and anxious, waiting. Military planners began thinking in minutes instead of months. Railway schedules were mapped for soldiers. Supply depots were calculated down to the last boot. Mobilization plans were written so precisely that stopping them would cause chaos. Once activated, they could not pause. This was called efficiency.
but it came at a cost. Leaders began to believe a comforting lie. If war came, it would be short. If plans were perfect, chaos could be avoided. If speed was absolute, victory was assured. No one remembered that the last war began because of a sentence. France aligned with Russia. Germany reinforced its ties with Austria-Hungary. Britain drifted closer to both, watching the balance. These alliances were meant to prevent war. Instead, they guaranteed it would spread. A conflict between two nations would now involve many, like dominoes. Here is the unsettling truth historians debate. By the early 1900s, Europe did not stumble into war. It locked itself into it. Diplomacy existed, but only within the limits of mobilization plans. Peace depended not on trust, but on everyone believing everyone else would wait. They wouldn't. Governments still spoke of restraint, newspapers spoke of honor, generals spoke of readiness. But once a nation mobilized, others had to respond, not because they wanted to, but because the system demanded it. Stopping was no longer an option. Europe did not know where the next spark would come from. The Balkans were tense, empires were fragile, nationalism burned quietly. Everyone knew a spark was coming. No one believed it would be the one. The lesson of 1870 had been misunderstood. The war had not begun because someone wanted chaos. It began because communication failed and pride refused to pause. Now, Europe had removed the ability to pause entirely. By 1914, when crisis arrived, leaders believed they had no choice: mobilize or be crushed, act or fall behind, move or lose everything. The system moved faster than wisdom.
June 28, 1914. It was a warm Sunday morning in Sarajevo. People gathered along the streets. Windows were open. The city felt calm. No one believed history was about to change. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was visiting the city. It was a political gesture, a display of authority, and a dangerous choice. Sarajevo sat in a region filled with tension, ethnic pride, resentment, and fear. But officials believed the visit would be routine. They were wrong. Along the route stood a small group of conspirators. They were young, inexperienced, nervous, not masterminds. Students, idealists, some barely trained. Their plan was fragile. One wrong move would ruin everything. As the motorcade passed, one conspirator froze. Another threw a bomb. It bounced off the car. The explosion injured bystanders, but not the Archduke. The car sped away. The attempt had failed. Or so it seemed. Later that day, Franz Ferdinand insisted on visiting the wounded. The route was changed, but the driver wasn't told. At a street corner, the car slowed, then stopped, by accident. Standing nearby was Gavrilo Princip. He had given up. The mission was over. Until, suddenly, the Archduke was in front of him, a few feet away. No guards, no escape, just chance. Princip fired twice. One bullet struck Franz Ferdinand. The other struck his wife, Sophie. Within minutes, they were dead. Not because of genius, not because of destiny, because of a wrong turn. Authorities panicked. Was this an isolated act? A terrorist attack? A foreign plot? No one knew. But assumptions filled the silence. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia. Evidence was thin. Emotion was not. Here is the most disturbing truth. The assassination did not cause the war. It activated the system. Mobilization plans were opened, timetables consulted, alliances tested, and suddenly, restraint vanished. Messages were exchanged, deadlines set, ultimatums issued. Each side believed the other would back down. None did, because backing down now meant falling behind. Leaders told their people, this will be short. This is necessary. This is defensive. They were wrong. Historians still argue, if the driver had not turned, if the route change had been communicated, if someone had paused just once, would millions still have died? We will never know. The world did not explode immediately after the assassination. There was no instant chaos, no sudden marching armies, no global alarm bells. Instead, there was silence. Governments paused, diplomats waited, newspapers speculated. For a moment, history seemed unsure of what to do next. Austria-Hungary took weeks to respond, not because they were confused, but because they were deciding how much violence they could justify. Behind closed doors, officials debated. Was Serbia truly responsible? Was this a crime or an excuse? Evidence was incomplete, proof was thin, but outrage was loud. Austria-Hungary did not want justice, they wanted certainty, and certainty only came from force. Germany watched closely. Germany promised support, not caution, not mediation, support. This promise, later called the blank check, changed everything. It told Austria-Hungary that consequences would be shared, that escalation would be protected, that restraint was unnecessary. And so an ultimatum was written. It was long, harsh, humiliating. It demanded Serbia accept blame, allow foreign investigators, and surrender parts of its sovereignty. It was designed to be rejected. When Serbia replied, they agreed to almost everything. Almost. That was not enough. Austria-Hungary declared war. Still, the world did not fully grasp what was happening. Russia felt threatened. Serbia was small, Slavic, connected by culture and pride. Russia mobilized, not to attack, they claimed, but to prepare. Germany saw mobilization as aggression. They issued warnings, deadlines, ultimatums of their own. When Russia did not stop, Germany mobilized too. France watched Germany. France had its own wounds, old losses, unfinished revenge. France mobilized. Belgium stood in the way of German plans. Belgium was neutral. Neutrality did not matter. Germany invaded. Britain entered the war, and suddenly the silence ended. What followed was not strategy, it was momentum. Railway schedules dictated timing. Military plans left no room for pause. Leaders claimed they had no choice, that once mobilization began, stopping was impossible. This was the great lie. They always had a choice. But choosing peace required courage, and courage was the one thing missing. Within weeks, Europe was at war. Within months, trenches were dug. Within years, millions were dead. And none of it had been inevitable. That is the most disturbing truth. The assassination was not destiny. The war was not fate. It was a series of decisions made by tired men, pressured by pride, fear, and the terror of appearing weak. Each believed someone else would stop it. No one did. Soldiers marched believing they would be home by winter. They were buried instead. Entire generations disappeared into mud, gas, and wire. Empires collapsed. Borders vanished. New hatreds were born. and it all traced back to something unbearably small: a wrong turn, a misunderstood message, a refusal to slow down. History books later called it the First World War. At the time, it was simply called the war, because no one imagined there would be another. But seeds were planted. Anger left unresolved, punishment disguised as peace, resentment carefully preserved. The system that failed once would fail again, and next time it would be louder. In the final part, we will confront the question no leader wanted to ask. What if the war didn't start because of one man with a gun, but because no one knew how to listen? Sleep on that thought. History already has. When the war finally ended, the world looked around in disbelief. No one had won what they expected. Cities were shattered, fields were graves. An entire generation had vanished into uniforms and smoke. Yet the most dangerous thing left behind was not the destruction. It was the story people told themselves about why it happened. Governments needed explanations. Leaders needed excuses. Nations needed meaning. So the war was simplified. Blame was assigned. Responsibility was narrowed. Complex chains of failure were turned into neat slogans. Germany was blamed. Austria-Hungary dissolved. Empires disappeared. But the deeper truth was buried. The war did not happen because one nation was evil. It did not happen because one man fired a gun. It happened because communication failed, repeatedly, at every level of power. Warnings were ignored. Intentions were misunderstood. Messages were delayed, softened, edited, or rewritten to sound stronger than they were. Diplomacy became theater instead of dialogue. Every government spoke loudly, but listened quietly. Telegrams crossed borders stripped of context. Ambassadors spoke in riddles to avoid offense. Military leaders assumed the worst and prepared for it. Fear replaced clarity, and fear is contagious. After the war, peace talks began. They were not calm. They were not generous. They were emotional. France wanted security. Britain wanted balance. The United States wanted ideals. Germany wanted survival. What emerged was not peace, but punishment. Borders were redrawn by people who had never seen the land. Nations were created overnight without shared identity. Grievances were frozen instead of healed. The Treaty of Versailles promised never again, but it was written in a language of humiliation. Germany was blamed publicly, financially, and morally. Reparations crushed its economy. Pride collapsed into bitterness. And bitterness does not disappear. It waits. The same failures returned, louder this time. Political speeches replaced nuance with certainty. Crowds were told simple stories for complex pain. Enemies were named. Once again, communication became weaponized. And once again, people listened to what they wanted to hear. By the time the next war began, the lessons of the first had already been forgotten, not because they were hidden, but because they were uncomfortable. It is easier to believe wars are started by monsters than to accept they are started by misunderstandings allowed to grow. Even today, we repeat the pattern. Messages are shortened. Context is lost. Outrage spreads faster than explanation. One sentence can still change everything. A tweet, a headline, a speech clip taken out of context. The tools are new. The weakness is the same. History did not warn us with explosions. It warned us with silence. Moments where someone could have asked, "Is that really what they meant?" Moments where slowing down could have saved millions. But slowing down looks weak in a world obsessed with strength, and so the cycle continues. The Franco-Prussian War began with a misedited telegram. The First World War followed misheard intentions. The Second World War grew from unresolved words. Each time the world told itself, "This is different," it never was. The most terrifying lesson of history is not how violent humans can be. It is how easily humans misunderstand each other and how rarely they try to correct it. Empires fall, weapons evolve, technology advances, but the human need to feel right instead of understand remains unchanged. That is why history keeps whispering the same warning, not about war, about listening, because the next catastrophe will not announce itself with drums or marching feet. It will begin quietly, with a sentence, misheard, misinterpreted, and believed. This is where the story truly ends, and where our responsibility begins. Long after the documents were signed and the soldiers returned home, the misunderstanding still lingered. It lived in textbooks, in national myths, in the way children were taught who was right and who was wrong. History was no longer a record of events. It became a narrative, carefully shaped. Each country told the story in a way that protected its pride. France taught vigilance, Germany taught injustice, Britain taught inevitability, and no one taught uncertainty. The idea that the war began not from certainty but from confusion was uncomfortable. Confusion does not create heroes. It creates questions, and questions are dangerous. So instead, people clung to cleaner explanations. Someone must have planned it. Someone must have wanted it. Someone must be blamed. But if wars begin from misunderstandings, then no one is fully innocent, and no one is fully in control. That idea terrifies societies, because it means history is not driven only by great men and clear decisions, but by fragile systems and human error. It means disaster can happen even when no one intends it, especially then. As decades passed, the telegram that helped trigger the Franco-Prussian War became a footnote. Few people remembered the exact wording. Even fewer understood its impact. Yet, the pattern it revealed never disappeared. Governments continued to communicate through filtered channels. Leaders continued to perform confidence instead of honesty. Public statements became tools, not truths. Behind closed doors, diplomats still whispered uncertainty, but publicly they shouted resolve. That gap between private doubt and public certainty is where danger lives. It creates pressure, and pressure demands release. In modern times, the same mistake happens faster. Messages are shorter, reactions are instant, nuance has no patience. A sentence travels the world in seconds, but understanding does not. We react before we reflect. We assume intent before asking for clarification. We share outrage before verifying context. The world has become louder, not clearer, and that makes misunderstanding more powerful than ever. Think about how often conflicts escalate today, not because of actions, but because of words. A phrase interpreted as an insult, a statement taken as a threat, a translation slightly off. Each side assumes the worst. Each side prepares accordingly. The tragedy is not that humans are violent. The tragedy is that humans are impatient. We rarely pause long enough to ask, what if this is wrong? History shows us how costly that impatience can be. The Franco-Prussian War reshaped Europe. The wars that followed reshaped the world. And all of them share a common thread: decisions made faster than understanding. It is tempting to believe we are smarter now, that technology protects us, that education has solved this weakness. But technology amplifies emotion. Education does not guarantee humility. And humility is the missing ingredient, because to prevent misunderstanding, someone must be willing to say, I might be wrong.
Leaders rarely say that. Nations almost never do. So history repeats, not because we forget facts, but because we refuse lessons. The most powerful forces in history are not weapons or armies. They are assumptions. Assumptions about intention, assumptions about meaning, assumptions about enemies. And assumptions are rarely questioned until it is too late. By the time truth catches up, the damage is already done. Graves are filled, borders are redrawn, memories are scarred, all because of something that could have been clarified. One question unasked, one message unchecked, one moment of patience missing. History is often taught as a series of dramatic events, but behind every dramatic event is a quiet failure, a failure to listen, a failure to clarify, a failure to admit uncertainty. That is the real warning hidden in the past. Not that war is inevitable, but that misunderstanding is preventable if we choose to slow down. And that choice is harder than any battlefield decision, because it requires restraint in moments that emotion demands action. History does not reward restraint in the short term, but it punishes its absence forever. The story of one misheard message is not just about the 19th century, it's about now, and about the next sentence the world chooses to believe without understanding. Because the next war will not start with a bomb. It will start with confidence in a misunderstanding and silence where a question should have been asked. If history has a quiet villain, it is certainty. Not the kind built on evidence or patience, but the kind that feels complete before the facts arrive. The Franco-Prussian War revealed how quickly certainty can form and how rarely it is questioned once it does. Once people believed the insult was intentional, every action afterward was interpreted through that belief. Troop movements became threats, silence became strategy, clarification became weakness. Each side reacted not to reality, but to its own interpretation of reality. That's how misunderstandings harden into destiny. What made the moment especially dangerous was timing. Europe in 1870 was restless. Empires were fragile. National pride was loud. And leaders feared looking weak more than being wrong. Public opinion mattered more than private truth. So when the edited message spread, it landed on dry ground. People were ready to burn. And once anger takes hold, logic rarely survives. Even those who suspected the wording was misleading stayed quiet, because challenging the narrative meant challenging momentum, and momentum feels unstoppable. But momentum is just fear moving faster than reason. The most tragic part is that the people most affected by the war had no role in starting it. Farmers, workers, children. They never read the telegram. They never debated its meaning. Yet they paid the price. History often praises leaders for decisive action, but rarely asks whether the decision itself was necessary, or accurate, or based on truth. That omission is not accidental, because if we question the foundations, the entire structure becomes unstable, and nations prefer stable myths over unstable truths. So the story became simplified. Germany insulted France. France responded. War followed. Clean, understandable, wrong. The messy reality that no one fully understood what they were reacting to was buried, because messiness does not inspire loyalty, but fear does. Fear unites faster than understanding ever could. That lesson was learned well, too well. In the years that followed, governments refined the art of messaging. Statements were crafted not for clarity, but for reaction. Ambiguity became useful. Plausible deniability became policy. If words could provoke without accountability, they became powerful weapons, and they were used. again and again. By the time the world reached the 20th century, miscommunication was no longer an accident. It was a strategy. But the danger remained the same, because once a message leaves its origin, it belongs to interpretation, and interpretation cannot be controlled. The same sentence can inspire unity in one place and outrage in another. The same silence can be read as restraint or as preparation for attack. Words are fragile, yet we build empires on them. The Franco-Prussian War is remembered as a clash of nations, but at its core, it was a failure of communication under pressure, a reminder that systems collapse not only from malice, but from haste, and haste is rewarded in politics. Those who pause appear indecisive, those who question appear weak, those who rush appear strong, until the consequences arrive. And consequences do not care about appearances. They arrive quietly at first, then all at once. Cemeteries are filled with the results of rushed certainty. Borders are drawn by the aftermath of misunderstood intentions. History textbooks smooth these edges. They turn confusion into purpose. They turn accidents into inevitability. Because inevitability is comforting. It tells us nothing could have been done, but that is rarely true. Something could almost always have been done. A delay, a clarification, a refusal to react publicly before understanding privately. But restraint is invisible. It does not make headlines. It does not satisfy crowds. So